the values of your kingdom.
Pleasant good morning to one and all. Before we commence, I wish to acknowledge and welcome back the Honourable Leader of Government Business, the Honourable Member for St. Michael South Central. Southeast, the Honourable Member for St. Michael Southeast. I hope to see you here on a regular basis.
Are not having to say that, but that I will be back for good. I thank you.
Minutes of the meeting held Tuesday, 15th January 2019.
Minutes, right? Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the minutes of the proceeding of the Honourable House of Assembly at its meeting, which have been circulated, be taken as read. Second.
The question is that the minutes of the meeting held Tuesday, 15th of January 2019 be confirmed. If there are no corrections or observations, then let those minutes stand confirmed.
By Your Honour the Speaker. Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General, petitions, papers, government notices, private members' notices, notices of questions, reports from select committees, first readings of bills, statements by ministers, congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notices of motion for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Move that standing orders number 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, subsection 5, 43, and 44 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are so suspended.
Government business.
Government business is now the order of the day.
Order number 5, in the name of the Honourable Prime Minister, Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs and Investment, to move the second reading of the Planning and Development Bill 2019.
Honourable Prime Minister.
I call it 2019 because I didn't really amend.
Mr. Speaker, I am really very honored to stand in this chamber this morning and to introduce this bill, which is a critical part of our government's agenda prior to the seeking of a mandate from the people of Barbados. One of the things for which this party agitated was significant change to the manner in which we deal with planning and development in Barbados, recognizing that the current legislation which governs us was indeed passed by this honourable chamber in the year in which I was born. And as much as I want to continue to feel that I am young, regrettably the colour of my hair is reminding me that having not been dyed, the process of years is taking hold of me. And therefore, sir, I say that because a half a century song's good only in cricket, not in life, nor in terms of legislation in an era where timeliness is important to development. This is one such area. Our country has seen significant changes over the course of the last 53 years, and with those changes have also come a change in what we expect from the values of the legislation that we bring to this honourable chamber. It was okay in the 1960s almost to pass legislation that did not require significant consultation. To do so in the second decade, almost the third decade of the 21st century, is really to fly against all of the acceptable norms of good governance. It was okay to pass legislation in the mid-1960s that did not seek to have inclusiveness, because that was not one of the key objectives, even though governments wanted to democratize and to enfranchise. They did not yet see inclusiveness as part of their remit across all spheres of social and economic activity. It was okay for us to talk about the passage of town planning legislation in the 1960s that focused purely on the role of the town planning department and the limited role of permitting, without contextualizing it in the context of sustainable development, without contextualizing it against the background of consistency with social and economic policies of a government as a whole. But we live in 2019 today. Next year is the third decade of the 21st century. And therefore any legislation which is brought before this honourable chamber has to have at its core the principles of transparency and accountability, the principles of openness and inclusiveness. It has to seek to be efficient and effective. It has to be contextualized against the overarching goal of sustainable development. And it has, Mr. Speaker, as we say all the time, to be fit for purpose. These are the things by which we will come to measure not just this piece of legislation, but I dare say, Mr. Speaker, almost every piece of legislation that we bring before this honourable chamber. The Public Financial Management Bill, which we just passed, also meets these same considerations and principles. Mr. Speaker, sir, we also have to recognize that we live in a country where the use of technology is pervasive. We live in a world where the use of technology is pervasive. And therefore, to have an analog government in a digital world is literally to commit a crime in today's world. To have an analog government in a digital world. We have, sir, systems and processes that are still rooted in the best precepts and management systems of the mid-20th century, but have no framework or capacity to accommodate e-governance or electronic applications, or to be able to meet the timeliness of instantaneous communication as is required in the digital world in which we live. And Mr. Speaker, we have also to consult and to talk with the people whom we govern. And sir, this legislation does not only speak to these principles, the route by which this legislation has reached here has exhibited all of which I have just spoken about. There were indeed, sir, 2 stakeholder consultations at which I was present and chaired on the 16th and the 26th of July. And therefore, you begin to understand the priority which this government placed on this bill by ensuring that within the first 2 months of being elected, that we were meeting with the public of Barbados on the substantive concerns that have now led to this bill. Sir, we didn't stop there, and I want at the outset to take this opportunity to thank the Minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs, Honourable Member for St. Michael South Central, for helping me to lead this process on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week, and monthly basis, and we could not be here without her leadership of this matter. But I also want to thank the 4 consultants who have been up front and center at every stage of these consultations. And sir, I did not give you notice of an intention to call anybody's name, but I beg the House's indulgence for the ability to place on record, and for the benefit of Hansard, our gratitude to Mrs. Christine Toppin-Alahar, Mr. Kim and Mrs. Sandy Penfold, and Mrs. Yolanda Aline, for all 4 of them helping us to do this monumental work, which will hopefully change the way in which planning and development in Barbados is done as we go forward. But more so than that, be one of the critical platforms for the unlocking of economic growth in this country. A feature so critical, and which I am told is being reflected upon in the negative outside of these chambers, and maybe inside sometimes, that the government has no growth plan. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me for the record say that this bill is one of the most important non-fiscal plans for triggering of economic growth in this country. And why, sir? I have before me on my desk a running order, and these are not the ones that go to the town planning department. I have before me on my desk a running order of over 110 applications that are just beachfront and agricultural subdivision. Some of them go back to even when the Barbados Labour Party was last in government, locking up expenditure, locking up economic activity, precluding the opportunity for people to be able to make investments and to employ people in this country, because we are being held hostage by a system and a piece of legislation that has stopped working for us a long time ago. We didn't come to government to have to decide for the first time, having gotten in government, that this was an area that needed to be reformed to unlock economic growth. We knew that before we were elected. And because we knew it before we were elected, like with other matters, Mr. Speaker, we prepared ourselves and we planned for it. And we were therefore in a position to have early stakeholder consultations, and we were in a position equally, therefore, to work with the consultants to frame the kind of document, the kind of policy framework that would inform the legislation, the drafting. And I also want to thank the Attorney General and his department for working with the consultants to allow us to be here in good measure and in short time. Now, we have spent the last 6 months as a government stabilizing the economy, stopping the bleeding. Our reserves, which we inherited at 400 million, are in excess of $1 billion. $1 billion and 59 or 61 today, can't remember. We have been able to restructure our domestic debt, and our team was in Washington, D.C. this week, dealing with the restructuring of our foreign debt. But we always understood that once you stabilize the bleeding, you needed a parallel path to trigger growth. And that parallel path to trigger growth will come from a combination of policy intervention and legislative intervention, which are non-fiscal. It will come from fiscal measures, such as the capital works that we choose to do as a government. It will come from decisions, as we have done, to establish Barbados as a medical and educational hub. And if anyone does not believe that the inclusion of Ross University with 1,500 students and 100 and something faculty will not bring growth to this country, then I don't know where they are living. Growth is also triggered by fiscal measures, by determination of how we spend our money, by ensuring that it is not spent in corrupt practices but spent for good measure. One of the first decisions this government made, unlike the last government, was to support the West Indies England tour in Barbados, being able to bring over 6,500 tourists here this week. And to have the benefit of that influx of tourists, not just for this week, but we also have it for people who were here to watch them as they practice, and people who will be coming back, Mr. Speaker, for the 2 one-days. But yet they say we have no growth plan. Mr. Speaker, sir, words can frame anything. But at the end of the day, there must be a substratum of fact. And there must be evidence to support the contentions that we make. If not, we become divorced from reality, and people will then begin to wonder whether we have taken leave of not only our senses, but of our memory and our capacity to reason. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is that this bill is just but one of those initiatives that is intended to streamline how our economy and our society functions, to be able to allow for a greater level of inclusiveness in our society, so that we get the kind of society in which every Barbadian feels that they have a chance to be able to plan out their lives and plan out their investments without having to be in a position where they know somebody or can call a favor or pay for a favor. This is about giving people a chance to be able to go through the processes fairly and squarely and transparently. And let me come therefore, Mr. Speaker, because I'm conscious that the full speech that I would have really liked to have given today, I will have to curtail a bit because I have to participate in a regional security system and RSS meeting in another half hour or so to deal with regional security and national security matters, to which I will speak to the country later today. But the bottom line is, sir, that the legislation which we have before us really does seek to be able to allow for ensuring that we can remove the things that would take away from good governance, or the things that would admit of conflict of interest, or the things that would require us to be able to build trust and confidence in the system. We try to do in here. In a small society like ours, it is important to make sure that we guard against influence being used because of how close we are to people or who we know. And this legislation therefore tries to set a framework that reduces the potential for undue influence and for corruption, and it will require of us very high standards of integrity, including making sure with the new entities that we establish under the legislation that there are declaration of interest wherever and a clear understanding as to how to act in a conflict of interest. Similarly, we seek to reduce bureaucratic delays by setting some clear timelines for conduct and behavior, and as I said, the Honourable Member for St. Michael South Central will carry you through the details of this bill when she speaks, and also to ensure that at the end of the day that the public of Barbados recognizes, as well as the people who work within the system, either in town planning itself or in the other government departments that have to be consulted, or indeed the professionals who work with the department on a regular basis, that we must try to meet these timelines, because it is in the interest of all for us to be able to process decisions quickly. But it requires improved platforms for data sharing and use of technology. Right now, town planning, when we came into government, in spite of the fact that it has an electronic platform for itself internally, was not sharing, and we are trying now to let it happen, its files electronically and digitally with the other ministries, Ministry of Public Works, Ministry of Agriculture. All of these are ministries, Mr. Speaker, who very often have a role to play in the determination of planning decisions. But we revert to the old files that breed sinus problems instead of being able to literally have a network that allows everybody to see what they are reviewing and to be able to make their comments contemporaneously, even, as is the case with other types of activity within our society and economy, within our world. And we have therefore to bring the town planning department and the other allied departments fully into the 21st century with respect to the technology that it uses, and to allow all of the players to be able to have access to all of the information and the evidence in order to be able to make good decisions. We've also said that we need to be able to encourage public participation, both with respect to the formal planning process and with respect to individual plans, particularly the complex ones that will come to engage people's concerns. Mr. Speaker, the key things that impress me about this bill relate, and I spoke about it recently in the region, is the fundamental shift in how government functions by introducing the concept of provisional refusal, such that if you apply to the department and the department is minded to refuse your application, we are saying in this legislation that they can't only tell you no, but they must also move to tell you what will trigger yes in your application. And why is this important? How many times have we heard stories about people who have submitted, they wait forever and ever to be told no. They then go and resubmit again, only to wait forever and ever again to be told no again, and then a third time. When in truth and in fact, all you need to do is to have a conversation and to tell people, look, instead of going 30 meters from the high water mark, we will allow you, we are requiring you to go X, 30 plus X. But we will relax on the curtilage to the side, or whatever other considerations you're prepared to do. But what this bill does is for the first time introduce into our laws a government that recognizes that the role of town planning is not simply to be regulatory, but to be also a facilitator of economic development and economic growth against the best precepts of sustainable development. And Mr. Speaker, we don't only therefore introduce the concept of provisional refusal, and this, I want to thank the consultants for walking with us and breaking new ground here. And I want this to be an example to all young members of Parliament. Because very often we take precedent from overseas and believe that the only thing we can do is to draft according to what we receive from overseas, sir. But good drafting comes from good policy. And once we can settle the policy well, the draftsmen can draft in accordance with the settled policy framework. And we believe, after, and certainly for those of us who are long in tooth in government and in public life, that one of the key areas has been this continuous, is almost a game of Russian roulette. What is it that will cause them to agree? If you want to come in any way at all outside of the straight and narrow. And therefore this concept that says, look, we will give you a provisional refusal, but in telling you what will trigger a yes is really a conditional acceptance. You have then a time period within which to say, yes, I agree with what you are saying with respect to what would trigger yes. No, I don't agree at all, in which case an appellate process kicks in. Or, yes, I agree, but I really would like to have a conversation because I feel that I would like to find out from you what to do with A, B, and C, in which case the planning department then has 28 days within which to have that discussion with you after you have 14 days to decide when you receive the conditional acceptance. These are the things we believe will bring greater certainty, will reduce the opportunity for corruption, and will allow for more seamless decision making with respect to investments in this country. I dare to make say, and I make bold, this legislation will come to be regarded as much for this point as it is for the other key departures, like the establishment of the statutory board, which we are introducing into our administration of planning and development for the first time. And it is because, like the other mechanism which we have sought to use in the Immigration Act in 2007, and we are doing it now with the Accreditation Council, where we shift the burden of proof to the applicant, there are non-fiscal ways where we can use to bring about efficiency, which we can use to bring about efficiency in this country and to bring governance and government into the 21st century. I spoke as well, Mr. Speaker, just now, about the establishment of a Planning and Development Board. That is another key deviation from what currently exists within our current system. Right now, you go to the Chief Town Planner, you have some matters that go to the Minister, you have an appellate mechanism. What we've tried to do, Mr. Speaker, is to establish a statutory board, not a statutory corporation, because the statutory corporation carries with it a whole host of other, like the NCF or the BIDC or any of those other statutory boards, statutory corporations, carry with it a whole mechanism. Town planning will still remain a department of central government. Its administration, its officers will still be employed by central government. They're still subject to the Public Service Act. They're not subject to any other legislation. But the powers to be exercised by a Planning and Development Board, particularly with respect to complex applications, because we do not expect that every application that comes into town planning must go to this board. Simple applications, dwelling houses, etc. will continue, simple office buildings will continue to go to the Chief Town Planner for determination. But more complex applications and other things which are devolved to the board will go to the board for greater transparency. And it's a 12-member board, and who sits on the board? The Chief Town Planner, by law, sits on the board and will be the executive secretary to the board. But you will also have 4 ex officio members from other government departments like Public Works or Agriculture. But then you have 7 members who effectively come from different parts of settled professions. And the minister must choose persons. 1 must come from a recommendation of the Barbados National Trust, and 2 members must come after consultation with the professional bodies that govern this area, the architects and the engineers and land surveyors. And then the minister has discretion on 4 members, but those 4 members must be drawn from either private sector, business, academia, or non-governmental organizations, legal profession, financial institutions. In other words, all members must have some knowledge and experience relevant to land development if they are to make a meaningful difference to the functioning of the board. And this is what we require with the legislation. A person can serve for up to 3 years at one time, but another significant departure in this legislation, and I hope that we will see it in other aspects of our governance shortly, is the introduction of term limits, so that they may serve no more than 2 terms with respect to their functioning on this Planning and Development Board. We would do well to follow this example of term limits in other aspects of our governance, but that is a debate for another day. Mr. Speaker, sir, those who are concerned about the potential inefficiency of the volume of work that will go to this board, the board is required to meet at least once a month, but may meet more regularly. But more importantly, as I said earlier, not every application that comes to the Town Planning Department will go before the board. The first schedule to the bill identifies complex developments, which will be decided by the board, and provision is made for most of the applications to be determined by the Chief Town Planner. May I say that in this bill too, the minister retains the right to be able to give directions requiring that certain applications or classes of applications will come to the minister for determination. And that is critical in a small society in which economic activity has to be unlocked. We keep that from the old legislation, more or less, but we recognize that those are likely to be limited to matters of strategic, important economic or environmental significance. I certainly feel that subdivision of land does not need to come to the minister. I really feel so. And I really feel that a board is better placed to determine whether agricultural land should be subdivided than me as a political elected person to the ministry. For the minister to get involved, I believe that it would have to be of significant economic or environmental importance to the country as a whole, as opposed to the day-to-day routine of every single subdivision coming for 2 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres. Because what then happens is that your system is held up because the minister has other things to do besides decide on these agricultural subdivisions. Coastal, we will probably retain because of the limited access to coastal lands and coastal development and the extent to which that is significantly affected or significantly affects our economic activity. But even that we will review as time goes on. Strict time limits are now introduced into this bill, even with respect to ministerial decisions, and ministerial decisions are final, obviously subject to the judicial review for breach of process, which the Attorney General can speak to in greater detail if required. Mr. Speaker, sir, we also, in this bill, and I'm conscious of the time now, want to be able to ensure that we protect the Barbadian vernacular and that we protect our natural and cultural heritage generally. You know, sir, one of the things that has concerned me personally is the extent to which we have allowed that proud Barbadian tradition of how we build to be lost as we continue to see more and more persons copy and mimic styles that are neither unique to us or even pleasing to the eye. And it recalls in my mind the words of Bob Marley's Concrete Jungle. And while we need to build structures that are strong, we can build strong structures that reflect some semblance of who we are based on what we have evolved in terms of our Barbadian vernacular and architecture throughout the years. I feel particularly on our main arteries and highways that there is much to be said for us seeking to encourage Barbadians to build in that style. When you go to Bermuda, sir, what do you see? There's no doubt that you're in Bermuda when you are in Bermuda. None whatsoever. And that's part of the charm, and that's what people pay the extra value added that they pay for. And I feel the time is not past for us to seek to regain some of the beauty of the Barbadian vernacular. Let's start with Robert Street. Robert Street had a charm because of the buildings with the overhanging verandas. It is true that it represented a time past where people lived above and the merchants, as they generally were, conducted business on the ground floor. But we could have the same type of architecture with restaurants and other forms of activity. And I must tell you that this is an area of activity that I would like to see return to Bridgetown, Oistins, Spikestown, Holetown, in particular, because there are still a few examples of these buildings in each of these towns. And if we can encourage young architects to embrace the Barbadian vernacular, and if we can use our planning legislation in ways that is not heavy-handed, but that identifies unique areas where we can encourage that kind of activity, then I think we will have done much to add to what we have inherited as a stock of buildings in the 21st century. We didn't get the designation by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site by accident. And we're unlikely to get it for anything that we're doing now. So that we must ask ourselves the question, how can we do things differently to be able to protect our built heritage, but at the same time, sir, our natural heritage too? And it requires from us a conversation that goes way beyond what we have had thus far. Mr. Speaker, sir, we also include a definition for development that makes it clear that no one can demolish or make material alterations to listed property of a site without first obtaining planning permission. Mr. Speaker, I say that conscious that some buildings may well be unsafe. And if they're unsafe, then an engineer certificate can be brought to be able to say, look, we really can't sustain this building in its current form, but what we would like to do is to rebuild it, being faithful to the architectural integrity which we have before us. So, Mr. Speaker, and I can think of one such building which has been the subject of public discourse, and it is likely that we are going to have to see it rebuilt because the engineers have indicated that it is unsafe. And I refer to the Samuel Jackman Prescott home in Black Rock, which we would love to keep as is, as part of the Nightingale home complex, but the building is unsafe. And the worst thing that can happen, as the member for St. Thomas would tell you, and their concerns are real, is for any of those children to go playing in that building and God forbid something happened to them. Any of them. Or even for the staff working on the premises. But we want to be faithful to the architectural integrity of the building that Samuel Jackman Prescott, the right excellent Samuel Jackman Prescott, lived in. And therefore any redevelopment of that building has to mimic as far as possible the architecture that, certainly with the facade, that was there before, because we recognize that if you build a building in the third decade of the 21st century, you're going to probably have building efficiencies that he did not have in the 19th century. So you have to accommodate that variation, but equally, you have to recognize that we can preserve the architectural integrity of what we're dealing with. We also, sir, include in this bill provisions for emergency listing to provide interim protection to an unlisted building where the minister deems it necessary. So it does not only relate to buildings that are currently listed, but buildings that are not yet listed. And I can think of a few chattel houses in this country that really ought to be included in that list. And in some instances, sir, you know, when I was Attorney General, the former Prime Minister at the time felt strongly, and I agreed with him entirely, that the site at the corner of Eagle Hall and the site otherwise known as John Moore's Bar in Lower Carlton were part and parcel of the cultural integrity of this land, and that government should seek, if necessary, to protect them as a public purpose for through compulsory acquisition. And I agreed entirely, because we hitherto would have seen public purpose only to relating to things like road safety or economic activity in the traditional sense. But if we don't define and protect who we are, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it for us? And a government of Barbados, therefore, has to recognize that part of its responsibility is protecting the cultural integrity of who we are. Mr. Speaker, sir, there are also powers provided for the formal designation of heritage conservation areas. In these areas, demolition or alterations to buildings will require formal permission. And similarly, protection of areas of natural beauty or interest, including, interestingly enough, and I say this because my government is the first government to formally have a Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Blue Economy, that included in this area is submarine and subterranean areas of our jurisdiction. And for a government who believes that part of our pay-forward responsibility is the rebuilding of coral reefs, it is important then that these powers be given here. We also have the power for the making of tree preservation orders. And I enjoy telling people, Mr. Speaker, the name of my house is a couple of branches because I have an obsession with trees. And if there are one of a few things for which I would want to be remembered when I leave this earth, I would like one of them to be that I got Barbadians to love tree planting and trees and the protection of our trees again, because I think is a fundamental part of who we are. Indeed, sir, I hope that part of what will come to be known as We Gathering 2020 next year, that we can encourage every single Barbadian, both living here and returning, to plant at least one tree in the year 2020, and that we will shortly roll out the trees that we would prefer that you plant, not that we require that you plant. But we are conscious that the number of mahogany trees has significantly declined in this country, and that we want to see more mahogany trees planted in Barbados again. We are conscious that food will forever be an issue in our future, food and water, and therefore breadfruit trees and golden apple trees. And the Ministry of Agriculture is coming up with a list of trees for us. But we really feel that part of the beauty of this country has always been the trees. If you ever stood on the site of the old Queen's College building, the current Ministry of Education site, and you just looked into St. Michael, deep urban Barbados is significantly different from a number of other deep urban areas, even in the region, because of the number of trees that we still have within the urban corridor. Bush Hall, for me, is special because of the number of trees that we have in Bush Hall. And to that extent, sir, I hope that this legislation and the ability to make the tree preservation orders and to be able to, we have had some legislation dealing with it in the past, but it is fair to say that it is dealt with more in the breach than in compliance with it. And if anybody who has gone by the Cubana Monument, and my colleagues know how I feel about it, one day about 2 years ago, the NCC or others, diverse others, to use the language of the type of law that should have been enforced against them, gathered and chopped, butchered the trees there by the Cubana Monument, opposite that residential tourism development that looks out to the sea. I would hate to think that that was the cause of it, but suffice it to say, it's the constituency of the member for St. James Central. Suffice to say that I hope that that kind of butchery does not happen again, because we can chop down a tree in seconds, but it takes years to grow. And in many instances, the trees which we plant in 2020, many of us on this front bench will not be around to see them fully mature as mahogany trees because of the length of time that it takes. These are the kinds of pay-forward projects that I feel our generation has a responsibility to be able to deal with. Mr. Speaker, I'm conscious of the time, but I want to address one other matter. Enforcement has been a major problem. Two other matters. Enforcement has been a major problem in our legislation to date, and this legislation seeks to make the enforcement process simpler, I believe, and seeks to correct some anomalies that currently exist. And I hope that persons will recognize that we are trying to make the system easier, but equally, if you mash the crease, back to the pavilion you go. That you cannot make it easier and facilitate, more facilitating, but still encourage breaches, Mr. Speaker. You give people a wide ambit, You make the timelines more facilitating, you facilitate as far as you can. But if after, if after all of that, people want to ignore the law, or people want to come in direct conflict with the law, then the town planning department has to act, and the sad stories cannot suffice in place of acting. And I refer also to the government, sir, because there are too many other examples recently where there were enforcement orders to remove islands in the road, and ministerial intervention stopped it. And all other kinds of things came to happen, including, regrettably, loss of life. But I'm happy to say today that I believe that that island that was the subject of grave concern is no longer part of the highway of our land. And it is another case, you know, when people say that we talk, or I say watch me, and they won't watch me, I want you to watch me. And not just in terms of those things, and we're not dodging or hiding from anything, because anybody who knows life knows that life presents different circumstances to you every day, including from your own health right back round to the circumstances in your environment within which you function. And you have to be equal and up to the task. And I've already said to this country, when you give us the mandate, we will deal with it. Relax, we have it. And with respect to the island and the road, and irrespective of whatever else had to happen to facilitate Ross, the government was adamant, you cannot breach the law and benefit and prosper from it. You have to deal with the matter. And I'm happy that the developer has agreed and has taken the appropriate action, and as a result, a roundabout is there to facilitate the access in and out in a safe way, but at the same time, that which was an obstruction naturally in the flow of the road is no longer there. There are other examples that remain unresolved with respect to enforcement, and we need to be able, therefore, to have a more seamless approach to it. The one with the concrete next to the power plant, the former Prime Minister approved that during the course of April last year. And what I will not do in this country ever is seek to arbitrarily reverse decisions, because there is one government, but equally we must ensure that there are no environmental infractions taking place with respect to the operation of that facility with respect to cement next to our power plant. Mr. Speaker, sir, the other area relates to the discussion with respect to heights and density. Singapore, Barbados is 430 square kilometers. Singapore is roughly 670, 680 square kilometers. Not quite twice the size of Barbados. But of significance, Barbados' population is 280,000. Singapore's is almost 6 million. And they're going for 7. They are 15 times our population, but less than twice our size. And of importance, in the size, 23% of that 670 square kilometers is reclaimed land. They have reclaimed more than 1/5 of their land space. For those who say that we don't know or that's not possible, there was a man called Grantley Herbert Adams, who we refer to as the Right Excellent Sir Grantley Herbert Adams, who reclaimed the land between Pelican Island and the mainland of Barbados, such that those of us born in the 60s never saw Pelican Island. So that the notion of reclamation is not unusual. And that is why we will have to come to deal with how we treat to the maritime jurisdiction and not just the onshore jurisdiction. But of equal importance is the recognition that there needs to be a more efficient and effective use of the land that we have, which may require greater vertical build in some places. And I must confess that I have had to become a convert to this way of thinking. I didn't always feel this way. I, like most others, believed, oh, I want to be able to see buildings no higher than 2 stories or 3 stories. But the truth is, it's not going to allow us to fuel our development. And what we have agreed, and I believe the new physical development plan, and the minister, member for St. Michael South Central, will speak more about the physical development plan and the fact that we are looking at 10-year processes now instead of 5-year, because 5 years is too short a window to do any serious long-term planning. But we have to come to accept that the 55-foot restriction that we have is going to limit us, and that in some instances, not across the entire coastline, because as I just said, we do not want a concrete jungle either, but that we are going to have to use vertical heights in a more creative way to be able to fuel economic development and at the same time ensure an aesthetically pleasing environment for our coastlines such that Barbados retains its charm. The aesthetics matter, don't get me wrong at all, but equally our ability to fuel greater economic development and to allow for greater density in certain areas matters. Similarly, I feel that there are other areas where we need to reduce density with respect to housing, like in the public housing areas of the Pine and Wildy, in Silver Hill and Gall Hill. And my government is committed to finding areas of land. The member for St. James South is whispering Haynesville. My government is committed to finding areas of land that allow us to be able to have a housing policy that is more sensitive to the needs of a modern Barbados and that does not admit of the kind of unfortunate social conditions that we have inherited that people have to live under. And I speak of circumstances that I see when I go in the Pine Wildy. The member for St. Michael Southeast can speak to the kind of conditions under which people are living. Houses that were built in the 1950s, built for 2 generations at most, a mother, father, and children, but are now regrettably hosting 4 and 5 generations in the same physical space. That density has to be reduced, and people have to be given opportunities to be able to live in a dignified way in the country of their birth, and my government will be a part of that exercise. So there is a nuanced approach to development, and this legislation, we believe, allows us to be able to take that nuanced approach. It is empowering, it is facilitating, it shifts the whole discussion, and Mr. Speaker, it tries wherever possible, and I said it to the draftsmen, limit the Crown's liability for compensation. Because one of the other things that we've done regrettably over the years is to pass legislation without our full appreciation for the extent to which we impose liabilities on the state for damages. The one that I can think of most relates to the question of conditions of work and the legislation that we passed to which the Crown was bound with respect to the conditions under which people face in the workplace. And I'm not trying to be difficult, but a small state has a limited exposure. And if damages are large all the time, or people are ignorant as to what levels of liability are imposed on government, the government may find itself bankrupt again in the future. Mr. Speaker, sir, the bill also provides for a new tribunal to hear planning appeals, and I believe that this is a matter that garnered significant support in the consultation. The present system sets out no timelines for decision making, and therefore has resulted in significant and large backlogs and long delays. And I can tell you, because as I said, the files that cause sinus problems are feet high. And I have inherited from the last administration more appeals than I would even like to begin to tell you, because it is a travesty with respect to how our system has functioned. What is proposed is a tribunal of 3 members appointed from a broader panel of 6 to 9 persons on a rotation basis, and we need to be able to use the system more effectively and efficiently. And we hope to have a clerk of the tribunal appointed by the permanent secretary to help manage that process to facilitate greater activity. And clear timelines will attach to the appellate process. So, Mr. Speaker, I have come this morning to lend my voice to this process. This legislation in and of itself will not change everything. Member for St. George North will go down into our local history for saying that you can't legislate out a culture. He was correct. But it is the first major step to reforming how we treat the planning and development in Barbados. And I believe, sir, that the other activities which the government has planned now to deal with change management, to deal with retraining, to deal with public education, to deal with the introduction of greater technology, not just at the town planning department, but in the other ministries, and then to facilitate the digital submission by the practitioners, that those things will make a significant difference. I also want to say, sir, that we have not been deaf, and I'm told that as recent as the consultation this week, and I know that the minister was also on brass tacks and other public engagements along with the consultants, but that there was a very reasonable set of representations made that would see us reverse sections of the bill that would otherwise negatively impact draftsmen in the country. I want to say, Mr. Speaker, my government is not insensitive and therefore has heard the representations and has asked that the following amendment be made in committee so as to facilitate the ability of draftsmen to be able to continue to work on single dwelling houses and duplexes and apartments up to, I think, a number of 10 apartments, which will significantly allow them to continue to maintain their way of life and their earning. And those amendments will be made on the floor. This is what consultation does and produces for us: the ability to be a responsive government. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe that even what we pass today may still not be perfect, but our role as a government is to be able to come in here and to make changes to reflect the reality of what we want our society to look like and how we want our society to function. And the pursuit of perfection is very often the greatest obstacle to progress. This bill is not intended to be an obstacle to progress. It is intended to be a platform for economic growth. It is intended to be a platform for economic enfranchisement. It is intended to deepen our democracy by allowing for greater transparency and accountability and inclusiveness, effectively for good government and good governance. It is intended to root out the engine of corruption, delay, lack of transparency, and obscurity. It is intended, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate sustainable development of the land which we love, but in a manner that is pleasing aesthetically to the people who we are, because we too have a proud history and we too have a culture, and we have learned that we can walk and chew. We have learned that we can pass legislation that reflects our needs, that introduces new concepts into our governance, like the provisional refusal and conditional acceptance, but at the same time allows us to respect the precepts that the planners and other professionals in this area have come to understand to be good practice according to not just what they say in Barbados, but universally. Mr. Speaker, it is against that background that it gives me the greatest pride to move the second reading of the Planning and Development Bill, replacing legislation that has been the law of this land for over 53 years. I ask, therefore, that this House, in good faith, consider the passage of this bill to allow us to move to the next stage of our development. I'm obliged to you. On the dot. I reserve, you right?
Honourable for Christchurch West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to make a very brief, but I think important contribution to what I think is an excellent piece of legislation that will certainly garnish the support of the whole House, I believe, and certainly my support. First, I think I'm in a unique position to give the perspective on this legislation, not only as a Member of Parliament for Christchurch West and the Minister for Transport Works and Maintenance, but in my past life as being a developer. And I think it's important because we get to see, hopefully from my submissions, both sides of the coin. I was part of and initiated, and I counted them, 14 developments in this country. And that meant that I had to relate to the Town Planning Department not only 14 times, because you would appreciate that when you make an application to the Town Planning Department, and I can see a lot of people that I would have interacted with here in this chamber, when you make an application and there are things to be changed or things to be adjusted so that your application is successful, it's important that you have to develop a relationship and communicate with the Town Planning Department quite often sometimes, so that you get, firstly, an application that is acceptable and approved, and secondly, an application that fits in with the area in which the development is being done. So I fully appreciate and understand why the concept of provisional refusal has come into this new bill, and I think that it is an excellent addition to the legislation, and I think something that we can use not only from the Town Planning Department's position, but also from the developer's position, so that we can get to a situation where more developments are done faster, and there are not delays in development. You know, I look, Mr. Speaker, at the developments that I did, and the average time that development used to take to get application through was 3 years. And I had one that took 8 years, Mr. Speaker. And when you get an application or a development that takes between 3 years and 8 years, obviously it is something that holds back development and holds back investment in a country. It got to the point, Mr. Speaker, that I only started to buy land that had planning approval and planning permission already. Because it was taking so long to get approvals that I said, well, the only way I could do it and make it better to invest and develop this country and help to develop this country was to look for places where planning approval had already been achieved. And you do find those places. It took me longer to find a piece of land, but I would do it. And I'm happy that this legislation has come, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the respective time limits and the requirements for time limits. I remember when I went to the consultations, and also forgive me for using Ms. Toppin Alahar's name, but I heard her clearly say, and I spoke to her about it after, that there was this concept in some jurisdictions that if you made an application and it was not approved or refused within a certain time, it was deemed to be approved. And I really like that. And I was hoping that that would have made its way into this legislation, because it put the onus on the department to make sure that they get the legislation through and not create bottlenecks for development. Because at the end of the day, if an investor has money to invest, to put it into the country, to put our people to work, to provide housing, to provide whatever development is, education, infrastructure, commercial development, it is something that we must welcome because it is part of the build-out of this country and is important. I heard the Prime Minister say that she is a lover of trees. Well, I must tell you, Mr. Speaker, as a developer at that time, I had to differ with her. I was a lover of concrete. Because concrete meant that it was very little maintenance. It meant that I could control what was being done, how it was being done, and it meant that I knew it would be there for years. But what the town planning department helped to teach me, and I'm indebted to them for it, is that concrete isn't everything. That the aesthetics of the development is also important. And I learned it from the town planning department. And I can see, he was then the chief town planner. Please give me the opportunity to mention his name. He was then the chief town planner. Now, as fate would have it, he's now my permanent secretary, Mr. Mark Cummins. And he helped to teach me, because if it was up to me as a developer, I used to clear everything, start with a clean slate, and then build as I wanted. No trees, nothing. But he helped to explain to me that trees are good for shade, that trees are good for barriers between neighboring properties, the use of what we call grasscrete for parking and things like that, greenery as a whole, the use of hedges. And it helped to mold me, and it helped me to understand the benefits of the foliage that can be at a development that otherwise the developer would not have. So I'm indebted to him, and I understand it fully. And it was an experience, it was a learning experience, but it helped for me to understand that the regulator in the town planning department and the developer, when they develop a relationship and can work together, I think the final result is something that then everybody at the end can be proud of. So I think the regulations and the regulators have a definite responsibility, and it is something that we must treasure, and we must understand that the directions that those regulators take, and this is why this legislation is so important, helps us to define the Barbados and the kind of Barbados that we want to live in. I heard the Prime Minister talk about heights, and I'm a firm believer in developments going up and up, 10 stories, 12, 15, whatever stories it takes. And I'll explain to you why. The value of land is not in the land itself. The value of land is in its development. That's the value of land. My father taught me that long, long time ago. So if you have a piece of land and you have not developed it, you have not experienced the real value of that land. So every piece of land I got, I developed it as quickly as I could. And what I found is that in order to make some developments economically feasible, the only way you could do it is by going up. And I'll give you an example. Clearly, a piece of land on the beachfront in Maxwell, which you might have to pay $2 million for, and is only 20,000 square feet. In comparison to the same 20,000 square feet in Britain's Hill, of which you're going to pay 300,000, 200,000 for. So you're paying significantly more per square foot for the land at or near the beach, but to be restricted on the height or the amount of units that you can put on that piece of land makes the economics difficult to purchase that piece of land. So therefore, in order for a developer to make better use of the facility, to house more people, to be able to employ more people in the development, to be able to have more invested, you have to be able to increase the heights at which you go up, at which you can develop at. You have to be able to increase the density at which people can use that land, simply because the cost of the land is so much higher. So if the cost of the land is higher, and you have another option. it means that you either do that, increase it, which means you have more units on the same piece of land, which make it accessible to more people, or you have to do smaller developments, which means smaller numbers of units, which make it inaccessible because the cost you have to charge after the development becomes higher. And that's the dilemma. And I often tell people and young people who get interested in development, it is a pyramid. If you build a property that you have to sell for $2 million, there's only a small number of people that can afford a property for $2 million. If you use your development skills and build 5 properties for $400,000, it's still the same $2 million. But there are lots of people that can afford $400,000. So it means that your market and your ability to sell the development after is enhanced and increased. That you don't have to wait as long for a purchaser. So that's why I never got into the kind of developments for the 2 million and 3 million. I like the 400,000, the 500,000 development, where lots of people can buy, or lots of people can rent, or lots of people can get involved in the project. Because lots more than can afford, of course. I like that because my father told me long time ago. He says the value is not in the tin of corned beef that you buy. The value is in the rotation of the stock. The rotation of the stock is where you make the money. I see a friend of mine who is a pharmacist smiling at me because he understands the rotation of stock. Rotation of stock. So those who may not have experienced business before or who have experienced business would understand what I mean. So when you buy something or you build something and you cannot sell that to get the benefit in return, the value is not there. So Mr. Speaker, from the development point of view, this is timely. I think this will reduce the backlog. I think this will encourage investment. I think it will encourage development because there is going to be certainty that your application will be seen and heard within a time limit, and that those time limits will be adhered to. I saw time limits, where did I write it? 12 weeks. Everything else must be done within 6 weeks. You know, those are the things that developers want to see. The things that we know. That I have not only that it will be done within a period of time, once my application is complete, that I expect to see a return within that time, but more importantly, that the transparency, that if I have a grievance, or if I have to appeal, it will go to the tribunal and be heard within a period of time. These are the things that developers want to see. These are the things that developers want to understand, that there's certainty in the process and that there's transparency in the process. And I applaud this legislation. And I want to go back to this concept of heights. You know, Mr. Speaker, there are certain parts of the world where the heights of the various buildings have defined the skyline. To the point now that when you see certain skylines, you already know where that location is. When you see the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building and so on in the background of a photo, you know, without anybody telling you, well, that is New York City. When you see the Needle in Seattle and that distinctive design of it, well, you know that is Washington State, Seattle in the United States. When you see the CN Tower and the Air Canada Centre, you know that is Toronto. That defines the skyline. Well, I hope that we can get to a point that based on the infrastructure and the design of the buildings in Barbados, and when we see what I consider the Platinum Horseshoe of Carlisle Bay as the vision that the development plan has put forward, the new development plan has put forward, we would then be able to say, well, that is Bridgetown, Barbados. So it's so important what we do in terms of development, that it will change a whole country. Now, I heard the Prime Minister say, and I want to agree fully and completely with the use of technology. The Ministry of Transport, Works and Maintenance gets referrals. I think 30% of all the applications that the Town Planning Department gets go to the Ministry of Transport and Works for their comments. And I'm proud and happy to say that we are already implementing an electronic transferal and referral process. And it's a radial kind of process. So when applications come in, now rather than being what we call linear, which means it goes to this department, and then when that department is finished, it goes to the next department, and then when that department is finished, it goes to the third and the fourth and so on. This will now get all of the departments getting the application one time, so that they can put their comments on it and then electronically send it back, which means no hard files have to go from one department to the next. No messenger has to go and carry it. When it's finished, carry it back, go to the registry, get it logged in at the registry. When it's finished, get it transferred to a particular department, back to the registry, back to... All of that, hopefully, will come to an end, when everything will be done electronically. Now, I was trying to get all of the departments to use electronic, but my ministry is telling me that there's one particular section that has to have a printed copy. And I was pushing back on it, but they've convinced me that the technical work that they do, and that's the building standards, who have to measure distances for fire, between a fire exit and an exit, and that sort of very, very detailed and very, very technical work. And I thought they too could have done it digitally, but they're telling me that is the only departments that will still have to have a printed copy of an application. But I've asked them that even if they have to have that whether they would get a printer to do it so that we can get things done quickly, because I don't want any part of the department, any part of the ministry to be held up by analog principles and analog processes. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation, I think we will look back on it over time and say that this was the necessary catalyst. This was the necessary vehicle and engine that we needed to get this country back on a sustainable growth path. The Prime Minister alluded to it. The numbers of applications, the numbers of people who want to develop things in this country but can't get them, can't start them because of difficulties in the legislation. There's one other point I want to mention before I sit, and it has to do with the idea of subdivision of land. And the Prime Minister alluded to it, that she doesn't feel that that should go to the Prime Minister, and I have to agree with her. And in particular, the concept of ribbon developments. Now, we have many areas where there are large tracts of land that can be subdivided, that already have access to roads, already have access to all the services, already have access to drainage, and yet still can't get subdivided. Now, I know in other jurisdictions, those tend to get subdivided as long, thin strips, so that people can get access to land. Many times, Mr. Speaker, you meet people who are property rich and cash poor. Property rich and cash poor. To mean that they might have 2 acres, 3 acres of land, not large tracts, only one house on it, but cannot, because of the difficulties of subdivision, cannot access or subdivide that land so they can even repair the one that the house is on, or repairs to the house. And if they were given that opportunity to subdivide that land, that 3 acres into 3 1-acre lots, and use that money to then develop those or to fix even the house that they're on. I see it many times. There was a lady in my house, in my constituency, who I met, who was on 2 acres of land. 2 acres of land. I could not get, did not have the wherewithal to develop the land, because the subdivision required the road, the drainage, the electricity, the lights, all sorts of things. So subdivision, as it stood in the past, had a significant cost to it, and it therefore made it prohibitive for people with small plots to be able to develop them. And I think with this change in legislation, people like her would be able to get that subdivision without the output of money to get the subdivision in the first place, that it should stand on its own based on the infrastructure that already exists. So, Mr. Speaker, I think with those few words, I fully support it. I look forward to seeing it in action. And I don't know, maybe when I'm finished with this job and I go back to developments, maybe my developments will get done in 6 weeks rather than 3 years. I'm obliged.
Honourable member for Mr. Michael West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mine will not be the voice of a moneyed developer. And having made a submission relative to these matters when we had the green paper discussion, hopefully mine will not be a voice with which you will have to bear for too long. I do not know that any of us would want to stand and speak against efforts to improve planning policy in Barbados, because I think all of us properly understand that it is vital and integrally related to our efforts to develop this country. My duty is to point to what might be one or two cautions. My duty, notwithstanding the view of my honourable young friend from St. Michael's South, is to point to one or two potential loopholes in the legislation. And my duty is to raise questions which I would think the average Barbadian would consider to be pertinent. I was glad and very interesting to hear the Honourable Prime Minister say to us that there will be an amendment with respect to how this legislation treats to professional draftsmen. That was a representation made to me as well, concerned as to what appeared to be a disadvantage being served that class of professionals. I do not know what the specifics of the amendment will entail, but we look forward in a positive frame to those amendments being put before us when we get into committee. I believe all policy, Mr. Speaker, must be set in an ideological frame, in a parliament that operates in a political context such as ours. All policy must be put to the test of public approval. I applaud the government for having used a consultative process with respect to this particular matter, and to hear from people in Barbados as to where they think the country ought to go with respect to planning policy. And my view is, Mr. Speaker, that planning policy is very much a part of the efforts of transformation. You can't speak intelligently about transforming a society, transforming an economy, transforming a state such as ours without an understanding that part of your effort must be undergirded by sound and prudent policies around the business of planning. We have to have an understanding of what our economic orientation is as a country. And I think the outflow from our planning must reflect that understanding and relate to that projection of our economic orientation, both at present, but for the near and distant future as well. Where do we want to see the Barbadian economy go? What will be the productive elements of that economic space 3 decades from now? And the planning policy we assume or adopt, that we formulate, must make clear and direct reference and bear clear and immediate relationship to that economic orientation. Mr. Speaker, where do we want to see the Barbadian population go in another 30, 40 years? We're talking about human development. You're a sociologist, Mr. Speaker, by some experience. We're talking about social development. So how is Barbados to appear to us in terms of its human development profile, its social development profile 30, 40 years from now? And the planning frame that we adopt today must speak to that, must be indicative of our vision with reference to that, must be suggestive as to what our understanding is, as to where we are and what we are as a people 30, 40 years from now. The societal interrelationships. We have, Mr. Speaker, again, I'm sure you understand these things. We have a problem in Barbados with societal interrelationships. And that is going to be influenced for the better or the worse by planning frames, by planning concepts, by our planning policy. Social cohesion is an important dynamic in national development, whether you talk about a society or an economy. Social cohesion is related to the outflow from your planning policy. I am trying simply to say that when you plan for your development in these terms to which we refer in this piece of legislation, you are doing so with an understanding that there must be some ideological premise, some ideological base, some vision construct to which that policy and that planning relates. And therefore this bill must be put to those types of tests. And it must be proven to respond positively to those types of tests if its worth is to be realized. The Honourable Prime Minister hinted at this type of thing. Technology around us is changing. It's changing our world. And our world has to change to accommodate that. We talk about smart city and Bridgetown and smart city centers and Warrens, and some people are talking about smart societies. And everything is smart these days. The technology is very much shaping the culture. And the space around that culture has to adapt to the presence of that technology. Planning policy must accommodate that in its thinking. New modes of transport. You're talking about electric buses. Don't quite know where the money is going to come from to pay for them. I don't know who's going to buy them for us, and therefore whom we must repay, and at what cost. These things are very, very expensive, but that's not the point today. The point today is the new modes of transport. That has an implication for your planning frame, your planning policy. New housing concepts. Our money developer from Christchurch West, my honourable friend, says he wants to go as high up as possible. But he doesn't want to build large, expensive units that he can't get sold. He wants to build smaller units he can sell quickly. He wants to go high because he believes in the high rise. The Honourable Prime Minister says that with the limited space we have, the overpopulated context in which we live, the investment profile that we adopt, which invites many to come to our shores from far afield, suggests that our space, thus being limited, we have to go up. So you're talking about new modes of building construction, you're talking about new concepts in housing. Planning policy has to accommodate all of that. Mr. Speaker, you work outside of this chamber. You work in the legal profession. You're illustriously known for your success in that regard. And so is the Honourable Member from Christchurch East, constituent of St. Michael West, whom I represent with pride daily. And Mr. Speaker, you will not want to believe this, but I forgot with that remark what I was going to say. So the Honourable Member from St. George South has finally scored. He has finally scored. The point I'm trying to make, Mr. Speaker, is that we have big problems with law and order in Barbados today. People say we have a problem with crime. I say we have a problem with law and order in Barbados today. Criminal activity is but a part of that, a major part of that. But we have a problem with law and order, Mr. Speaker. People are very disorderly in some respects without being criminal. We have a problem with law and order. And our planning concepts, our planning policy also has to accommodate those issues that relate to law and order, both those which now exist and those which potentially we see coming down the road. If the policy is flawed, issues like that become more grave. Our policy has to take note of these things. The aging population, my friend from St. Michael East is now very much a part of the aged population in Barbados. It does not mean, though, Mr. Speaker, that his vitality is in any way diminished, because he represents me well. It may be chemically enhanced from time to time, but he still possesses of a measure of vigor that allows him to get the job done in terms of his representation at the constituency level. But he's reflective of our aging population in Barbados today. And our planning frames must take into account that we are an aging population. Our planning frames must take into account that there is a growing number of physically challenged people in Barbados today, with all the strokes and so forth with which we are now faced. Planning must take that into account. And when the Cabinet of Barbados sits in its caucus, I am sure the Honourable Member from St. George South will advise them that if you want truly to develop a culture of entrepreneurship, you have to take that into account with your planning policy. You say you're going to decriminalize vending, but it's more than just decriminalizing vending. You got to facilitate it by creating the economic space for it and the physical space for it, and not just a space, but a space which will lend itself to viability. You said that already. He sticks close to me, so he learns occasionally a thing or two that he takes to Bay Street on Thursdays. But he's my friend and I don't have a problem with that. But these things are very important. If you're going to see that entrepreneurial culture emerge, has implications for planning policy, or planning policy has implications for that, however you choose to look at it. And then, of course, there's the business of increased prosperity. I would like to think that each of us is of the view that down the road, that thing we call increased prosperity for more Barbadians, a more universal experience in Barbados, increased prosperity, shared prosperity. If we envisage that kind of economy, if we envisage that kind of society, then we plan for that, or we plan now to facilitate that. And I'm going to get perhaps a little bit later to comment a bit further on that, but I'm just saying that we've got to have a view that increased prosperity will be a reality, and that prosperity will be more shared, more universally shared in Barbados. And therefore, that implies certain things for the planning frames that we formulate. The goal must be sustainable development, Mr. Speaker. And I've heard it said with reference to this bit of legislation that it is intended to be developmental, not just regulatory. We've got to move away from that old staid path of the Town Country Planning Department being seen as simply a regulatory entity, and that's true. We should long have gone past that stage. If we're going past that stage, no, that's true. It should be part of our developmental thrust to have not only this agency, this department, but others. They serve other purposes in the same vein, the objective of which is development. We've got to make sure that that is in fact what they do become. But development is often a misconstrued concept. Because some people measure development, talk about growth, they talk about development, they're referring to an increase in GDP. You know, Mr. Speaker, because you deal with a lot of very poor people in Station Hill and Bush Hall. I grew up in that area, so I know what poverty is like. And you come face to face with it, as I do down in Richmond and in Alkins and in Vietnam and in Parsons Road. And the country can register improvement, increase with reference to GDP. And often the misview can be held that we're developing, Mr. Speaker, but there are many who are not beneficiaries of that measure of development. It's skewed. So benefits come, but they incidentally or deliberately fall to a few, where the majority are still excluded. So we can talk about this plan being a developmental tool, but that development has to be understood in terms of benefiting a wider group of Barbadians. We can put all kinds of guidelines for planning. We can put in all kinds of mechanisms of scrutiny. But at the end of the day, if those who benefit from physical development are narrowly the established few, the usual suspects, then we miss the point. And planning is not working for Barbados, it is working for a few Barbadians or a few visitors to our shores who invest some dollars from time to time. I'm simply trying to say I can appreciate the concept shared with us that this is a developmental tool, and the Town and Country Planning Department at the center of this is a developmental agency to facilitate business. We're going to improve the way it does its business, the rate at which outturns come and all of that. I can understand all of that. But if at the end of the day, the benefits of development are not being more widely experienced in Bush Hall and in Black Rock, and Mr. Speaker, that development is inadequate and insufficient for our people. Planning policy should be designed to help us democratize our space, our economic space. Now, Mr. Speaker, in another life, in another place not long ago, a few months, 7 or 8 months back, and leading up to that point, I would have said repeatedly that one of the biggest responsibilities falling then to the party of which I was a part when it came to government would be to further the process of democracy. But not only political democracy with respect to governance and all of that, but economic democracy. Because that is a task unfinished, started by those of our past who are now numbered among our pantheon of heroes, the Barrows, the Adams, etc. And unless our furtherance of the democratic process goes beyond governance, legislation, parliamentary procedure, unless it goes beyond these things and embraces and includes and facilitates further economic enfranchisement, then we are failing to democratize our economic space. People who try to make a living, who try to eke out a living, Mr. Speaker, and who find themselves harassed by the police, who are simply doing their duty in a context where the law suggests that's the thing to do. People who seek to eke out a living in a small, limited, forced space have to find that the way we plan, that planning policy takes into consideration their lot and their situation and provides a bigger space for them and facilitates greater economic activity and advancement on their part. All I'm saying is we can come to this chamber every Tuesday, sometimes on Friday. We can bring good bills. We can have grand notions and even make lofty speeches. But at the end of the day, these pieces of legislation must connect with the ground in Palmetto Square. They must connect with the ground in Cheapside, at Eagle Hall Corner. They must connect with the ground and democratize the economic space for the people whose lot is to be found there to try to eke out a living, while others elsewhere feast on the fatted calf. All I'm trying to say, Mr. Speaker. The goal must also be to build communities. We have to ask ourselves seriously the question, to what extent has development, physical development in Barbados worked against the positive building of a sense of community? We have seen community erosion, community scarring. We see traditional urban districts in Barbados now being described and labeled as hotspots, becoming a target for police and security activity. We understand why that is happening. But I'm going a step before that and asking myself, to what extent has the orientation around physical development and even economic development in Barbados and social development in Barbados, to what extent has that had a negative impact upon our traditional Barbadian communities? And how does this legislation address that matter? That we've got to understand that part of our business is community building, the building of communities across this wonderful. Much of the character, and the Honourable Prime Minister alluded to this, Much of the character of Barbados is identified with the traditional Barbadian district, and a lot of that is being lost. A lot of that is being lost. Modernization always comes with a price, but we always have to consider whether or not we're willing to pay that price. We have to consider what that price is, what the cost is. Villages once known for sporting prowess in Barbados are now known for something other than sporting prowess. Carrington Village, Bayland. As a young boy, we ran all around Carrington Village, Waterford. These places are known for sporting prowess. Districts in Barbados known for their creativity and cultural instincts. Places like the Pine. What are they now most prominently known for? Mr. Speaker, and how has historically the development orientation in Barbados contributed to that? And how going forward will development orientation address the issues now being evidenced in these places? These places are now more so known for crime and conflict, sadly. Have we paid sufficient attention to that? An effective and well-thought through policy on planning obligations is an important area of consideration. This legislation addresses the business of planning obligations. I spoke to that already. And we should not easily let people who make money out of the pockets of Barbadians come here and make an abundance of money and not ensure that their investment is accompanied by such obligations as would help to bring on the rest of the Barbadian society and economy as well. So the business of planning obligations is very important. Now, I haven't attacked my friend from St. Michael East on his experience. I want to join him very loudly on this matter of squatting. He has this problem in certain parts of the constituency. Others have it too. We even have it in St. Michael West. There are squatters in St. Michael West. There's squatters in the Bank Hall area, certain parts of the Bank Hall area. The squatting problem is a big problem. And I want to simply repeat the view that squatting instincts can only be viewed as lawless behavior. Squatting instincts cannot only be viewed as lawless behavior. And I know if there's one voice in here that will support me in that, it is my friend from the Ivy, my honourable friend, my parliamentary representative and neighbor, by the way. And squatting instincts don't only reflect proneness to lawless behavior. They're reflective of access issues, Mr. Speaker. People have problems of access to land on which to lodge themselves. That's a big problem in Barbados. It's a problem that we have failed to wrestle to the ground. Poor people, some not so poor, have problems with access to land in Barbados, and the squatting instinct in part. Now, I'm not suggesting that people do the lawless thing, go to squat. So everybody go and say that. I said that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying apart from the instinct to lawlessness, there are other instincts that drive that dynamic, that phenomenon. And lack of access to land is part of the problem. But the squatting instinct also reflects clearly the incapacity of the state to provide housing. And I'm not saying it is the sole responsibility of the state to provide housing for everybody. Certainly it's the responsibility of the state to facilitate access to housing for everybody. But the state has demonstrated its incapacity so to do. I believe the focus with respect to that has been wrong. We've been trying to provide houses to people rather than provide them with land. Squatting instinct comes from a lack of access to land and an inability of the state to respond to that particular problem. It reflects a weakness in the use of state lands when government is in a position to use those lands. There's a weakness in the policy with respect to how lands owned by the state are used. It also reflects, in my view, a continuing missed opportunity to facilitate people with a little bit of money. I'm not talking about the rich and wealthy and the prosperous, but people who have a little bit of money and who perhaps can find an entrepreneurial opportunity in helping to provide housing for lower income. Because I think Barbados has gone wild on this whole concept of lower income housing. Sure you would agree with me, Mr. Speaker, that what eventually appeared at Coverley and was intended, I understand, to be lower income housing is far from that. What appeared at the Grotto is far from that. Lower income housing. What appeared at Country Park Towers, Phase 2, is far from that. I'm saying that perhaps there is room for the state to create the environment, the facility, within the context of it, people with a little bit of money, not the wealthy, people like my honourable friend from Bridgetown City, people of that ilk, who can invest in helping to provide housing, but also make a little bit of money out of it without ripping off people and exploiting the lot of poor people. I believe it's a continuing missed opportunity that we don't even bother to look at. Now, Mr. Speaker, in many instances we bring legislation, we don't see the attendant regulations. We don't see the attendant regulations for this piece of legislation. Now, the devil, the proverbial devil, is often in the details. And bad regulations can undo good legislation. And bad regulations, which we don't now see attaching to this, can come later and cause all kinds of problems for the Town Country Planning Department and all kinds of problems for developers, money developers, like my honourable friend from Christchurch West. The devil, proverbially, is in the details. And
Said money developers, not property developers.
Moneyed developer.
Not property
He's
developer.
a moneyed developer of property.
I want to be clear that there's a distinction between a money developer and a property developer. That is a distinction.
I know there's a distinction, that's why I'm saying he is a moneyed developer of property.
And that is said in what kind of manner?
That is said to be very complimentary to him. He has a shrewd business head.
Just wanted for clarity.
And he's an honest businessman. There are still some like him in Barbados today. And he doesn't benefit from the largesse of the state in any way. And he doesn't benefit from his connection to any political party in any way, as far as I'm aware. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to see those regulations, and we pray that they would further the objectives here attaching to the legislation. Mr. Speaker, we have in this country a convergence of crises which we are not paying sufficient attention to. We have a convergence of crises. We have a deteriorating water supply and access problem. Right now, we see that largely as a St. Joseph problem, a St. John problem, a St. Andrew problem, occasionally a problem associated with other areas. But we have in Barbados a water supply and water service access crisis. I mean, the truth, we are in 2019 back. Now somebody said to me, Mr. Speaker, the other day, well, you know, they might as well return to the day of the standpipe. You know what a standpipe is, Mr. Speaker? You were of that vintage. I know what a standpipe is. I caught and carried water from the standpipe in the station. In fact, I knew when it was built, the well was dug. But we have a water supply and access crisis in Barbados. When on Christmas, people in eastern parts of Barbados can't get water for basic needs. When we have tanks which are crashing to the ground for whatever reason, whether it's sabotage or the age of the tanks itself. When we have companies coming to take up tanks which have been installed to provide a service, we have a crisis. It's not of this government's making, perhaps I'm not saying that. Just simply saying we have a water supply and access crisis in Barbados. I make that point, Mr. Speaker, to say that it is conversion with a sanitation and sewerage crisis. At the same time, my honourable friend from Christchurch East has been struggling from day one with massive sewage problems left to his hand at Christchurch and at Bridgetown. And there are other places, Mr. Speaker, you travel through urban Barbados. And there are some areas, I know a couple in St. Michael West, the sewage is escaping into the streets, into the atmosphere. It has to be attended to, and I'm sure that situation is replicated other places. So we have a water situation, a crisis, converging with a sanitation and sewage crisis in Barbados. There are threats to our physical development. There are threats to our environment. When the water resources are threatened, food security is threatened. If you have a sanitation and a garbage collection crisis occurring at the same time that you have problems with your water system, you have big problems. That's all I'm trying to say. Now, you can't say we don't have a sanitation crisis. I don't mean to attack my honourable friend again from St. Michael East. But when you go to the port at midnight to receive 2 small garbage trucks coming in on a big boat in Barbados in 2019, it means that we are at the level of crisis. If that is a big thing, 2 small trucks come in at midnight. Precisely, that the minister and his entourage find it necessary to be present at midnight in the Bridgetown port so that the people could be informed that 2 trucks have arrived. That is very suggestive of the fact we have a garbage collection crisis, we have a sanitation sewage crisis happening at the same time we have a water crisis. This is big trouble, Mr. Speaker. And can't talk about planning policy without talking about these things. I say these things not because I sit over here. I say these things because I'm a Barbadian, because they have implications for the image, the national image, but they also, even more importantly, have implications for national health. If the water supply, scarce as it is, if the water service, scarce as it is compromised by sewage or garbage because of our inadequacies in that regard. I have concerns, Mr. Speaker, over this matter of what we call the urban coastal corridor. I think some people start at Hastings, some people start at Worthing, some people start at Oyston, and they come along the south and west coast and they go as far as Fitz Village. And they say that's an urban south coast, west coast corridor. I have concerns as to what the plans are for the development in this area. We see the signs of what is likely to eventualize at Bay Street, Lower Bay Street. That controversy that is now, I think, still before the court, I'm not sure. But the question I really have to ask is, what is government's vision for this area for the future? I hear talk about where government headquarters now sits, being a prime area for tourism development. Well, let's be clear on that. If that is what it is, say clearly that is what it is, and that is what we're going to do. In future, we will not meet as a cabinet in Bay Street, meet at Warrens or wherever, and that this place will be given to tourism development. My concern is portals to the sea. My concern is recreational spaces for Barbadians. This is an area long known for recreational activity. As a boy, I went to what was called the aquatic beach. I should have learned to swim off the jetty there by the hospital under Mr. Lorenzo Best. But I witnessed one unfortunate experience of one person my age, and I never went back. I regret that very much today, Mr. Speaker. I'm one of those people to whom the Honourable Prime Minister refers who live on an island but can't swim. I will not ask you about your capacity with reference, or abilities with reference to that. The point is here, Mr. Speaker, this is a known area. We got the mix of tourism, we got the mix of domestic recreational activity and spaces. We need to know with a clear understanding what is government's vision for the development of all of that coastal area all through Bay Street and further into Brandons and Brydens, and because Bajans need to have those portals and Bajans need to have those recreational spaces, but Barbados needs to have investment. And all I'm saying is we need to speak with clear voice as to where we are going with reference to that. The pressures from the demands of investment, the pressures from human settlement, and those who pay attention to matters of tide and wave movement and climate change and stuff like that. There's a phenomenon I think they call coastal squeeze. And we may not be quite there yet, but that's a trend. The pressures of competing or contesting demands from the seaside and from the land side. We got to know what we are going to be doing with this south and west coastal areas. High-rise hotels. I'm being made to understand that this is where we need to go. And I heard the Honourable Member from Christchurch West talk about skyline profiles and identification of various cities by the skyline. Barbados is a very small space. A very, very small space. And though I understand the need to go up, I think we got to be cautious in how and where we do it. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me very quickly say a couple of other things to you. Now, in this legislation is provided for a planning and development board, which is to be lauded. A planning and development board. The aim is for accountability to avoid suspicion. Now, the composition of the board, as far as I could see, does not allow for the presence and participation of an independent, a person nominated outside of the state. They're no opposition nominee. I'm saying that matters of planning, matters of physical and other development relative to planning, in my view, should be managed by entities and mechanisms which can render as fully as possible service independent of a singular political directorate. I'm saying that, in my view, just like you have the Electoral Boundaries Commission, just like you have Police Service Commission, nominations to these entities don't simply come from the state. This board, to me, is playing a vitally important function as a planning development board. And you've got to be careful how persons are nominated, in my view, to that board to ensure that there's some degree of independence and objectivity, and there's not an overabundance of partisanship or partisan influence or political influence. Now, Mr. Speaker, on page section 86, section 86, 2, if I can find it. I don't have it here in front of me. Somewhere in the bill, but 86, page, section 86, 2, page 102, refers to the tribunal. Tribunal, I think, is a creature of the minister responsible for planning. The tribunal is a creature of the minister responsible for planning. We have to question the relationship, therefore, that will exist in the context of this legislation between the minister and a tribunal appointed by the minister. On page 55, section 7, it says, where the minister fails to give notice of a determination in accordance with subsection 5, or determines that a planning obligation shall continue to have effect without modification, the applicant may appeal to the tribunal in writing against that decision. That's the decision of the minister in accordance with part 11, set out the grounds of the appeal, but the tribunal is appointed by the minister as far as I could see, and therefore is a creature of the minister that is called upon to make decisions with reference to actions taken by the said minister. I also have to express concern and support the view by both the Prime Minister and the member for Christchurch West that matters of subdivision should not be falling under the purview of individual minister. I support that. Subdivision is one of those areas in Barbados around which the stories have been legend with respect to corruption. And the honourable member from St. Michael Northwest, in his previous life not being a parliamentarian, will not be able to get a portion of land subdivided because he's a little boy from Black Rock before coming here. But the fellow from up the hill there, who may be a little lighter in skin tone than he is able to get a subdivision because he has the wherewithal to make that happen. Those stories are many in Barbados. Lawyers know about these things. Pre-state confession about these things. And all I'm saying is, a matter of subdivision is something with which we have to be careful. And it is one thing that should fall to the purview of a wider and objective body, is something like that, so we can take the suspicion out of the, and the temptation out out of the process as has been, and coastal-related matters. The coast is very important. That's where a lot of the economic activity in Barbados happens. That's where a lot of the money is spent. Some of the biggest controversies that we have faced in the last few years have been around coastal entities or potential coastal entities. So these matters, I believe, should more properly fall to the scrutiny of a wider mechanism than that of a minister. Mr. Speaker, I hope we can get away from, I'm going to finish now so you can get some lunch. I hope we can get away from this business of these special accommodations that create peril and chaos. The Honourable Prime Minister made reference to the flawed physical structure in the road outside of Coverley. Before being Prime Minister and today, she has expressed concern about that. I have heard similar concerns expressed around the chaos at Warrens with respect to around the bow. We have accidents every day. And all I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, we have to get away from these special accommodations given to the moneyed class that create chaos and create peril. And if this legislation helps us to get away from that, then we are doing a good thing. I don't know about these things. I am in no way skilled in the design of these things, but that thing at Warrens, that's chaos. That's peril. You hate to drive through there, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure. And so do I. And that thing that was in the road or is in the road up there, I don't know which it is now. I'm happy to hear that it's gone. I hope it's gone. And there's one along the road there just outside of the bell. These things are dangerous. These special accommodations have to be taken out of the plot. And if this helps to get us there, then we are doing a good thing. We need to plan in additional ways for the impact of natural disaster, Mr. Speaker. We have areas of our west coast. We have areas of our south coast from which there is no swift escape passage, or if there is rather limited. One road. And these are low-lying areas. And we have had experiences of wave rise on our coastlines. Some of our emergency services, our critical utilities are in low-lying areas not far from the coast. Planning must take all of this into consideration. It must seek to correct the imprudence where it exists. And we've got some of that we have got to address. Now, environmental impact assessment. Mr. Speaker, I assure you in a couple of minutes I'll be finished.
You have all day, Honourable Member. You are not limited per time.
I thank you,
Honourable Member.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I have other places to be and other things to do, and so I may not be able to
I hope one of them is not Kensington Noble, Honourable Member.
Of all of that time.
Honourable Member, I hope one of them is not Kensington Noble, Honourable Member.
Sorry?
I hope one is not Kensington Oval. Honourable Member.
It's not Kensington Oval, Mr. Speaker. I have not been there in a long time. Since yesterday, in fact. Now, Mr. Speaker, on page 44, section 30, the copy of the bill I have, The chief town planner the chief town planner may require an environmental impact assessment to be carried out by the applicant in respect of any application for permission to develop land if the proposed development by reason of its nature, scale, or location could significantly affect the environment. That is clause 1 of section 30. Then clause 2 tells me, unless the minister directs otherwise, the chief town planner shall require an environmental impact assessment in respect of an application for a development of any kind mentioned in the 3rd schedule. Now, the minister therefore has the deciding power and a discretion with respect to environmental impact assessments. But, Mr. Speaker, you look at the 3rd schedule, matters for which environmental impact assessment is required and over which the minister has an overriding power. If you look there, Mr. Speaker, major transportation infrastructure, things like airports, marinas. Number 2, electricity generating plants, crude oil storage facilities. Number 3, sanitary landfill operations and waste energy incinerators. 5, wastewater treatment plants. 6, industrial plants for manufacture of things like hazardous materials and chemical products. Industrial estate development, land reclamation, hotel resorts, crematoria. Mr. Speaker, the legislation says the chief town planner may require an environmental impact assessment. Clause 2 says, unless the minister directs otherwise, and the reference is to developments listed in this 3rd schedule, some of which I have just mentioned. Now, I don't understand that. I thought that the Prime Minister's attempt to justify and explain that was weak. I look forward to hearing further from other voices on that particular point. It's not something that you can lightly pass over. These are very important, very, very serious. You're talking about landfills. You're talking industrial plants with chemicals. And the chief town planner, his department, may require an EIA unless the minister says otherwise. I don't know why that is necessary there, and how we can strengthen that provision so that we best safeguard ourselves. And I know when I make these points, some people get upset and think I'm attacking this. I'm not attacking. I'm saying it is reasonable to ask. And any Bajan out there who reads this will ask, why is it you provide for the town planning department to require an environmental impact assessment? Perhaps. But that in any eventuality, the minister can say otherwise. So the town planner can say yeah, minister can say no, or vice versa. And these are very important, very, very important areas. And I think that that should be relooked, perhaps in some way strengthened. I want to stop. I'm going to stop, Mr. Speaker. I want 2 other things I have to say, but they may be considered to be silly, so I'm going to stop.
Your Honourable, Mr. Microsoft Central.
Thank you,
We ain't going to lunch.
Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill, sir, having worked closely with the Honourable Prime Minister and the team of consultants and with the people of Barbados to help bring it to this stage. As the Honourable Prime Minister said, the bill came to this stage having gone through a robust process of consultation with the people of this country. I want to thank the Honourable Prime Minister for putting in context what the bill attempts to bring to the landscape of development in this country, how it, like other legislation that this government has been busy bringing to this chamber in the last few months, how it goes directly to the heart of the issues of transparency and accountability, which over the last decade have been mere whispers on the political landscape of this country. I want to thank the Honourable Member for Christchurch West who lent his voice to the debate, and I even want to thank the Honourable Leader of the Opposition for the interesting stream of consciousness intervention to which we were treated. I know that the Honourable Member cannot on this occasion complain of having not had sight of the legislation, as I myself laid it in this House on the 18th of December 2018, and he did finally come around to making some small references to the legislation at the end of his stream of consciousness. I, however, do not have the luxury of waxing philosophical for the entertainment of any disciples. I have come directly to the business of government that the people of St. Michael South Central elected me to do, but I thank him for the intervention. Mr. Speaker, the Planning and Development Bill of 2018 has 12 parts and 4 schedules that I will go through. But I want to speak first to certain parts of the legislation that will come and that will give further teeth and create a greater platform for the enactment and the execution of the legislation. And one of those is the Physical Development Plan, which is made reference to in the 2nd schedule of the bill. And I just want to take the time to make reference to what the matters for which provision is made in the Physical Development Plan. Now, it is important for us to understand that this bill does not exist on its own. The large, broad, deep, important matters of development cover a range of issues, and that the bill is subject to the country's physical development plan. And what does the physical development plan make provision for? Part 1 of the 2nd schedule makes reference to roads. Issues such as the reservation of land for roads and establishment of public right-of-way, construction of new roads, alteration of existing roads. Part 2 refers to buildings and other structures. How does the government of Barbados regulate and control the size and the height of buildings and fences, the purposes for and the manner in which buildings may be used? How does it regulate and control the design, color, material of buildings and fences? Part 3 allows for the bill to consider and make reference to comprehensive development planning. And I say that in response to those who may not realize, who may not be aware, that the bill is essentially attached to and cannot be considered separately from the Physical Development Plan. The current Physical Development Plan for Barbados, sir, dates back to 2007. A new draft plan is being developed in a similarly consultative process to that this current bill that is before the House benefited from. So Part 3 of the 2nd schedule, which relates to the Physical Development Plan, looks at comprehensive development planning, providing for comprehensive development planning at the intermediate and local levels, so local area planning, community planning, heritage area planning, the control of land by zoning or designating specific land uses, regulating the layout of housing areas, including density, spacing, grouping, and orientation of houses. This is not about individual buildings. This is not about growth as measured by GDP or even gross national income. This is about how this Barbados Labour Party government is developing communities, is developing livable spaces, is making sure that we consider not just the physical issues and the economic issues, but that we consider the social, the environmental, the biophysical. We are creating and developing a nation. Project Barbados in the next 5 decades and beyond is about creating a nation. And the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is well aware, or perhaps he may have forgotten over the last 8 months, that this is the orientation of this Barbados Labour Party government, of which he was up until very recently a part, for which he sat with us to develop those ideas and those principles that were represented in the manifesto that bears his signature at the back. Mr. Speaker, sir, the legislation is also subject to regulations. It is also subject to a development order. And the Honourable Member, Leader of the Opposition, questioned the development of these regulations and development order. And I will respond to say that these are being developed again in a similarly consultative process with the stakeholders that were with us on 2 occasions in July, where, having streamed those consultations, over 9,000 Barbadians watched and interacted with the conversation, with the discussion on the Green Paper and on the eventual bill. The Green Paper was placed online. We also received several comments on it, comments that were both related to technical issues as well as general issues relating to development and the government's orientation to development. We had a legislative review this past Tuesday where, as the Honourable Prime Minister mentioned, there were several things that came up at that stage. And this is not a government that is deaf to the reasonable arguments of the constituents that we serve. And when I say constituents, I don't mean in terms of our individual constituencies as members of Parliament, but all of the people of Barbados, all of the professional bodies, the experts who would seek to lend their voice. I have to say that, building on the principle of solidarity that Barbados has enjoyed, this country has galvanized itself in the context of the social partnership on a broader scale as Barbadians to be able to bring us to where we have gotten thus far. There are other countries, Mr. Speaker, sir, that have had to go through an adjustment on a long-term basis, countries as nearby as Jamaica who have not enjoyed the solidarity approach that Barbados has enjoyed. People willingly come forward and say, we appreciate the effort that you are making. We want to lend our voice to the discussion. This is the contribution that we have to make. And we are thankful, we appreciate those inputs because they help us to develop policy that, as the Honourable Leader of the Opposition mentioned, must connect with the ground. We in this chamber, sir, understand connecting with the ground. And as a matter of fact, some of us had to help the Honourable Leader of the Opposition connect with the ground in places that his sensibilities did not allow him to go, to be able to sit where he is sitting in this chamber today. So we know what it means to connect with the ground, sir. And we have made sure that our consultation allowed us to develop policy that does just that. So I want to come now, sir, and again, I have to thank the consulting team. I will confess that I am borrowing from the structure that they have used in presenting this to the people of Barbados as I go forward to outline some parts of the bill. As I mentioned, it has 12 parts and 4 schedules. And in making this presentation, sir, I want to frame it in terms of the purposes of the bill, to show how it responds, how the bill responds to the goals and the purposes that the Honourable Prime Minister outlined in her intervention this morning. So, apart from the preliminary considerations, the second part looks at the administration of the Act. Part 3 looks at physical development plans. Part 4 addresses the regulation of land development. Part 5 looks at building, engineering, and subdivision plans. The 6th part of the bill deals with protection of cultural and natural heritage. Part 7 looks at the control of outdoor advertisements. Part 8, enforcement. Part 9 looks at how does one acquire land for planning purposes. Part 10 looks at compensation. 11 deals with the process for considering planning appeals. And then there are other miscellaneous considerations that are looked at in Part 12. The 4 schedules are as follows. The first looks at the classes of applications that are to be determined by the Planning and Development Board. The second schedule, as I mentioned, looks at matters for which provision may be made in physical development plans. The third looks at the matters for which an environmental impact assessment is required. And the fourth addresses amendments. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, in terms of the administration of the Act, the existing Town and Country Planning Act outlined the role of the minister responsible for town planning. It made reference to a Town and Country Planning Advisory Committee, as well as the role of the Chief Town Planner. The new bill, sir, seeks to democratize this process. There remains a role for the minister that I will come to, but as the Honourable Prime Minister mentioned this morning, there is an important role to be played by the Planning and Development Board, which is made up of 12 individuals, many of whom have to be appointed on the advice of certain non-governmental actors, and I will explain. The board consists of the Chief Town Planner and 12 persons. The Chief Town Planner will serve as the Executive Secretary to the board. The board comprises 4 ex officio members from relevant government departments. In addition, the minister appoints 1 member on recommendation of the Barbados National Trust, 2 members on consultation with professional bodies representing professional land use planners, architects, engineers, and land surveyors, 4 members drawn from the legal profession, financial institutions, private sector, business, academia, non-governmental organizations. All members of the board must have knowledge and experience of matters relevant to land development, and as the Prime Minister, the Honourable Prime Minister mentioned in her remarks this morning, there are term limits to the acting of this Planning and Development Board, how long they are empowered to act. There's a role for the Chief Town Planner, and I want to make reference to the role of the Chief Town Planner and the Planning and Development Board with reference to what we now call the Planning and Development Department, or the Town and Country Planning Office. The Planning and Development Board is responsible under the bill for all applications. However, and in the consultations we had discussion about how this would affect the speed and efficiency, the board is empowered to delegate simple applications to the Chief Town Planner. But I want to make a further point. The point at which applications come to the board is not as they would come to the Planning and Development Office. The officers who sit to do their work every day are reviewing these applications and submitting them to the board so that they come to the board in a state, in a form that they can be considered. The board is not sitting there to review applications as they come in. The board is sitting there to be advised by technical officers of the planning department so that they can make certain representation, they can understand the issues to be addressed with the applications. But there is a role for the chief town planner. The role remains to consider simple applications, whereas complex applications, major developments, and applications that have a significant public interest would be the chief responsibility of the Planning and Development Board. There's also an appeals tribunal. I want to make something clear. The appeals tribunal, 6 to 9 people, who are from which group 3 are chosen on a rotating basis. The point of this is to make sure that if I have an application that is coming to the appeals tribunal, I do not know in advance who is going to be hearing my appeal. This is a small society, and we have to make sure that we do all that we can to preserve the transparency, the accountability, the integrity of our review processes. The tribunal is appointed by the Governor General on consultation with the Prime Minister. The tribunal is appointed by the Governor General on consultation with the Prime Minister. I want to repeat that for absolute clarity to those who may have misunderstood it in its presentation. So, I want to look at how the bill responds to the purposes that have been set out. So, the purposes include the facilitation of the development of land. And the Honourable Prime Minister spoke in her intervention about the role of the Planning and Development Office, not just as a regulator, but to ensure that development is facilitated not just for large investment interests, but that development is facilitated for regular Barbadians. I sat on a BRASTAX program a few days ago, and many of the people who made representations in this area were people who are simply trying to improve their circumstances and their environment. Of course, a large part of what we are doing here is meant to provide an impetus to growth and development. But we also want regular Barbadians. This is their country. It is our business as government and as their representatives to improve their lives. But we also want regular Barbadians to feel and to be materially a part of the growth and development process. And the fact is that when people feel marginalized from a process or from development, they do not feel like participating in any way. When people feel marginalized, they feel that there is a system that certain other people participate in, and that they then have to create their own system, their own subsystem or subculture. And the fact is that a lot of that is playing out today because over the last decade, people felt and were materially marginalized. People felt that there were two Barbadoses. And the task of this Barbados Labour Party government is not just to remove that division in a real and functional way, but also to remove the perception of that division, because people often respond to perception. And so we want to ensure that we are facilitating people's participation in growth and development. And that is what this bill does as presented. Second purpose relates to the attainment of appropriate standards of land use and development. Importantly, efficiency and accountability by public authorities regulating land development, and that is why we make reference to the timelines that I will come to in a minute. Public participation in decision making, not just in terms of this process of defining the legislation, but in terms of how people are able to make representation when they think that a development is going to impact them in a particular way. And this bill provides for them to make that representation. And it also allows for recourse to administrative and judicial proceedings for redress and for remedy. So let's look at the facilitation of development and how the bill responds to that purpose. As mentioned by the Prime Minister this morning, this bill represents a significant departure from the 54-year-old Town and Country Planning Act because there is an express statutory presumption in favor of development. And how is that manifested? Along with the provisional refusal that the Honourable Prime Minister made reference to, there's another very exciting part of this bill. And it has to do with approval in principle that can be granted at the conceptual stage of new investment. That replaces the outline approval of the existing act. Because the outline approval was really just a first stage of the approval process. The approval in principle is based on a conversation. Now, often what investors or applicants complain about is having very little information about what is expected or what would be accepted, and having to go and spend lots of money. And this is often young entrepreneurs who are looking to develop something and may not have the level of resources that others may have. They have to go and spend lots of money really for something that from the outset they could have been told would not have been accepted. The approval in principle gives general acceptance of the concept so that people have a basis on which to go forward and make further investments in their application. That's important because what was happening in the past is that lots of investors were deciding, well, you know, we have no idea what is the appetite of the government or of the country for this kind of development. And we're going to go to another country where we know for sure that this kind of development is welcome. And so the approval in principle, again, represents the orientation of the bill in favor of development. That is to say that we want to be able to say yes unless there's something expressly in the application according to the physical development plan and according to the other elements of the bill that prevent us from saying yes and that mean that we must say no. Under this proposed legislation, only projects that are of national strategic importance are to be referred to the minister. Provision has also been made, sir, under this bill for social, economic, and environmental impacts to be considered on an ongoing basis in the decision-making process. Another exciting part of this bill, sir, has to do with the use of planning obligations and how we are able to use them to make sure that we have a cohesive approach to sustainable development, that we are not simply creating concrete monsters, that we're not simply, as happened under the last administration, rolling in to people's communities and setting up developments and having young women and men sitting under trees nearby without access to the economic opportunity that some of these developments should allow. People should have the opportunity to be a part of the economic uplifting of their area. Because if they are left out, it is not for them. And we are sending the message to them that what we are doing as government is not for them. A government cannot and should not do that. And so the planning obligations allow us to make sure that investors also participate in the sustainable development and growth of the communities in which they are seeking to invest and benefit from. In matters of investments that benefit from the patrimony of a country, that benefit from the pristine and immaculate shoreline of Barbados, from the ocean environment, from all the other things that make this country so attractive to others, an investment or investor that benefits from that has an obligation as well to invest in the overall well-being of the country, not just for this generation, but for the future. And so while there was limited use of planning obligations in the past, considerations like whether you are including green spaces, considerations like how many young people from the area this particular development is employing, those considerations have now, as we build on a model of economic enfranchisement, as we use that as our approach to development, these considerations have now to be material to how we go forward with respect to development. The bill contains, sir, very strong measures for the preservation of amenity, tree preservation, and outdoor advertising. I want to say something about the preservation of amenity. The bill allows for action to be taken in cases where certain developments or type of developments or properties left in derelict conditions despoil the general environment of where they are located. And any Barbadian within the sound of my voice knows what I'm talking about. That we have a situation in Barbados where people are not called to account for some of the buildings that they own or properties that they own that are allowed to fall into states that might despoil the environment, but worse, might cause risk or harm or damage to people around them. Or people are using properties in ways that cause the environment around them and cause the environment around their neighbors to lose value. They're using them in a way that put their neighbors at risk. And this bill allows for accountability and for people to be forced to act to address those situations. With respect to efficiency and accountability, sir, I want to quickly speak to the matter of information requirements from the Chief Town Planner. And this is one of the other things that came out, not just in the consultations, but that has come up over years. And it is the notion that I submit an application, sir, having, I think, a good sense of what is required for my application. And then the Town Planning Office comes back and says, well, you didn't send this. You also have to send that. And what ensues is a seemingly never-ending back and forth about what I need and what you must send and what. This does not serve growth and development and efficient process. And so all information requirements must now be asked for promptly up front by the Chief Town Planner. Now, that is not to say that an application may not be deficient as it is submitted. This happens. So people may know that they must submit something in a certain way and they may fail to do so, and the Chief Town Planner may decide to remind them that this was always from the outset necessary and you have neglected to submit this. But this constant conversation where the Town Planning Office writes a letter to tell me that I must also send this, and then I must write back to say, well, what does it need to look like and by who must it be certified? That is a thing of the past under the proposed act. We have also set strict timelines for the processing of applications, including interagency consultations. So agencies such as the Coastal Zone Management Unit, the Environmental Protection Department that must consider certain types of applications have 28 days within which to respond. And further, the digital by default orientation of the bill means that we make use wherever we can and in an increasing way of a digital platform to process applications. And so that the e-planning system that is in place at the Town and Country Planning Department allows for applicants to submit their applications online, but also allows for the agencies to transfer applications for consultation and for comments on that online platform. And it is not yet finished, it is not perfect. the fact is that when we're talking about planning and development, we're talking in some cases about large plans. We have to make sure that people have the capacity not just to send, but also when things are sent around to read what is being sent, that they have the software. It is not a small thing, but it is something that the Town and Country Planning Office has already set up and is in the process of perfecting. And we think that that will add much value to the efficiency. Now, the timelines can also be extended by agreement of the applicant. And that is important because we feel that the planning architecture of government cannot be held up or cannot be held to timelines if the failure to respond is on the part of the applicant. But there's also considerable recourse when these timelines are extended or exceeded by government departments. And timelines apply to decision-making, not just by the Chief Town Planner and by the board, but also to decision-making by the minister. The minister responsible for town planning also has a duty to respond in a timely way. Now, I want to come, sir, to the question of public participation. Now, the Planning and Development Board has representation from the private sector, from the National Trust, and so on, and these are ways in which people with experience and with knowledge in the sector, whether that is engineers and architects or land surveyors, to people who are tasked with preserving the heritage of the country, have an opportunity to bring those views to bear. Minutes of board meetings, sir, will be public documents. And what does that mean? It means that not only is the public allowed to participate in the decision-making process before the decision is made, but the public is also told, can also go and see online what were the considerations that went into a refusal, what were the considerations that went into an approval being granted. And this, sir, we believe is important to the perception idea. Often people see something go up, they feel that they don't know on what basis it was done, they're not sure who the developer is and what they stand to gain, or who was involved in the contracting, or who won the bids, or who was employed. Giving people information about how government makes its decisions allows them to feel that justice is being done, to feel that their interests are being served, to know that their interests are being served. Publicity must also be given to some kinds of applications, including those that require environmental impact assessments, and as well as those applications for strategic projects that are being decided by the minister responsible. The Chief Town Planner has to account to complainants for enforcement decisions, meaning you can't just say, well, I have decided that you must move this from here because that is the ruling of the Chief Town Planner. It has to be based on some transparent process. Appeal decisions must be made public, and information will also be included in public registers. Finally, sir, in terms of going through the bill itself, access to the purpose that speaks to access to redress and remedy, and how the bill responds to this purpose. Appeals against decisions are made by the Chief Town Planner or by the board go to an appeals tribunal, and I made reference to how that tribunal is comprised. It must, similar to the Planning and Development Board, it must be comprised of competent people from sectors that are able to make real decisions about those that have been made by the Chief Town Planner or by the board. Further appeals on points of law coming out of the tribunals are referred to the courts, and appeals against enforcement notices will be made to a judge in chambers. Provision has also been made, sir, for appeals against stop notices. Sir, often what happens is that people feel as if there's a one-sided approach to process, that they are simply takers of whatever a body decides, and that they must simply sit and accept whatever is decreed. Sir, this Barbados Labour Party government does not serve by decree. And this bill further demonstrates, along with the Public Financial Management Act that recently came to this House, further demonstrates the commitment of this government to not just efficiency, having come off a decade of complete inertia. Not just efficiency is not just efficiency that matters, but it is also accountability, is also making sure that we are transparent in our process, that we give information. Information, sir, is one of those things that seems like something simple to say or simple to perceive, that people require information. But it is actually an economic input. People having a sense of whether their investment is likely to be accepted, about what are the government's priorities in certain development areas, people having basic information about whether, and by way of example, I will say, sir, that it came to the attention of the standing committee that reviews planning matters weekly, because that is this government's approach to getting things done, that we come together and say, what is the obstacle here and how can it be removed? We don't seek to kick the can down the road, but to take responsibility. But it recently came to light that there had been established a moratorium on certain developments in certain areas. And quite frankly, that people who were submitting applications were not aware. People have to be given information. It was a lack of information, it was a lack of response that caused the buildup of all of those files in the town planning office over the last several years. And those people, those files, if I were to bring them to this chamber, I could quantify in terms of the loss of income to this country and to the people of Barbados, the loss of an opportunity to get involved, to bring your labor or to bring the technology that you've developed or to bring anything that you have to bear on that particular economic activity. I can quantify it. Several of those people would have chosen to leave Barbados and take their investments to a jurisdiction and to a place where there was a prime minister who wrote something on a file other than for further review, for further consideration. That is not a decision. The failure to make decision costs money, and it costs people loss of opportunity. And we are seeing the manifestation today, sir, of that loss of opportunity for an entire generation of young people. Well, this Barbados Labour Party government is not going to lose another generation, sir. And we are going to make sure that we do all that is possible. Don't mind the waxing philosophical about what is the true meaning of sustainable development. It is demonstrated, sir, in this bill.
Correct.
There is no need to ask the question. And it is important to understand that in the administration, we do not say that we have all the answers as a government. That is why participation and consultation are important. In the administration, in the development of the regulations, in the development of the development order, in the further consultation of the physical development plan. We are confident, sir, that this bill will provide for the inclusive, sustainable development of this Barbados that we love. And with those words, I am obliged to.
Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of today's sitting until 3 p.m.
Question is that this honorable chamber be suspended until 3 p.m. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. This honorable chamber is suspended